morning, everyone. Welcome to session 7 of our Brand Alive Brand Expansion webinar series. Hard to believe we're already on session 7, but it's good to have you here this morning. Like Pete said, my name is Ella. I'm a digital media manager at Brand Alive. You probably interact with me through email and don't even realize it, but I'm honored to be here with you this morning. Just to kind of kick us off, we're going to start with everybody on mute. That's just to cut back on some of the background noise, but please feel free to unmute yourself at any point to ask a question. You can hop in the chat and ask a question if you have one. And then of course we'll have an open Q&A session at the end for any of your questions. And right now you're more than welcome to hop in the chat. Let us know who you are, what you do, where you're tuning in from. We'd love to get you to know you a little bit better. And also for you guys to get to know each other a little bit better and see who else is on the call. So while you do that, it is my pleasure to introduce TEDx speaker and award-winning author of Expand Growth Thrive, Pete Canalicchio.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you guys so much for being on this webinar today. Many of you I know very well, so I feel like it's old home week. For those I don't know, I would love to get to know you. So please reach out. Let's engage. Ask me questions or share thoughts, and let's keep conversation going. It's neat to build these relationships. I value all of what you have to contribute. You're brilliant people with great ideas and are doing amazing things. And so I love that you've decided to make me part of your world. So with that, without further ado, I will jump over the presentation. And as Ella said, jump in. April Jenkins, who's on the call today, is a former student of mine, and she knows from my classroom work, I don't mind being interrupted. I love questions that are really on your heart to be asked without having to wait, because a lot of times when you wait, you forget why you were asking the question in the first place. So let me go to slideshow. And we'll go ahead and get started. So as Ella said, this is session 7, the power of stories. And I'm really excited to get into it. Just to set the ground, I guess, for what we're talking about, we've been talking for the last couple of sessions on this thing I and Mark DeSoma, a brand strategist out of Wellington, New Zealand, created, which is this lasso framework. And lasso stands for lateral, addictive, storied, scalable, and ownable. So we're talking about the first S in the lasso model today, called storied. So just a second, let me advance. So let's talk a little bit about the lasso model first, just so you have perspective on it, because this is, I believe, a really good tool for you to help you as you think about your brand and your brand expansion. And if you're a brand expert, and many of you are, this model will help you prioritize your intellectual property. Which brands have the greatest potential to expand, which should be put in a secondary position, where you should focus your resources. If you're a brand owner but not an expert, the algorithm can help you determine how expandable your brand is. Is it underexpanded, or is it optimally expanded? Is it even overexpanded? And if it's underexpanded, kind of what should the next steps be to get it fully expanded? And then finally, if you're just a novice to this, and that's fine. A lot of us are brand new to things, and I'm certainly in that situation in a lot of cases. The lasso model framework still can be a relevant and useful tool in running your business, because it's going to ask you questions, and if you are thoughtful about it, you're going to answer those questions. And when you answer those questions, you're going to get tremendous insight that you didn't have before. So you got to do the work. I mean, nothing in life is easy or free. You got to do the work, but if you do it, it will have a significant impact on your overall success and overall well-being. So, stories, and I say stories are now an accepted part of marketing. My gosh, they've been accepted for a long time, but a lot of us are becoming new to stories. And the reason that stories work is because it's a way of explaining idea in something that comes to us naturally, right? Whenever someone says, let me tell you a story, we always sit forward in our chair, we kind of tilt our ear, and we're looking forward to what that person has to share. because when someone tells a story, it engages us in a way that is just intuitive, right? Storytelling and story listening are intuitive. This goes back to days when our mothers and fathers told us a story before we went to bed, or if you're fortunate enough to be a parent, what you potentially have done with your child. And certainly I've had the pleasure of hearing stories from my parents and giving stories to my children. And anytime that I did that, I always got them all perked up and excited to hear the story. And even if my story was made up, they usually thought it was interesting, which was very nice of them. Finally, or third in this is the ability of a brand to tell a story or stories that people connect with is vital to its success. Story is really important for brands. And we're going to get into that in a big way as we go through this presentation. And any brand wishing to add value to what it offers, not probably, but absolutely needs to add story if it wants to enhance the way it's perceived. So we all know who Seth Godin is. What did Seth Godin have to say about stories? Well, he says that successful marketers deliver stories that people want to believe about themselves, others, and the world as they see it. So he goes on to say, the huge power of stories is that they enable us to process information in ways that capture our imagination. I love this quote. I'm a former Coca-Cola employee. Coca-Cola has been a client of mine for a long time. And he says, we drink the can, not the beverage. And that could be a head scratcher, but when you think about the story, that's what we're drinking up. We're drinking about the brand and where it goes back to 1886 with the secret formula being created. 5 things that people believe that something has merit. This is important because it is kind of indigenous, or it's elemental to a story. First, they trust what is being said. Powerful brands tell powerful truths because the credibility they carry. There is consistency. Clear logic that holds everything together, underpinned by a central premise that speaks to the consumer. There is detail. Detail is so critical because specific data makes the story or the compelling thing real, right? If there's numbers that can be checked, that adds credibility to what is being shared. The story is concise where it needs to be, right? Don't be verbose. Brevity is really important. I think Mark Twain said, I would have written a shorter letter if I had had more time. Think about that. Finally, the story mirrors something of the way we all live. It feels real because the story talks about something we believe is real. I love this about Chupa Chups. This quote is from Christine Kuhl. Christine Kuhl is one of the 2 major licensing managers for the Chupa Chups brand. For those of you who don't know Chupa Chups, it's one of the biggest confectioners or makers of candy in the world. They're based out of Spain. They're a global company. And how cool is this? As she says, Salvador Dali designed the Chupa Chups brand back in 1968. Since then, the lollipop has become an icon for consumers. There's a huge emotional value of our brands for consumers who remember their experience and feelings. Well, what a story, right? To say that Salvador Dali designed your logo. And what I know also about Christine Kuhl and about Chupa Chups is they take their logo, they take their brand visual identity, and they shop it out each year globally to up and coming designers. And they bid for the opportunity to be part of the new licensing style guide. All these new designs get competed against each other. And then the Chupa Chups, or the company that owns Chupa Chups, selects the ones that are the winners. So they're starting with something that's rooted back in 1968, designed by Salvador Dali, and then they refresh it each and every year. So you've heard me say things should be surprisingly consistent and consistently surprising. And this is a perfect example of that. And
hey, can I jump in with a quick question?
Yeah,
oh,
please.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
If we go back one slide,
Sure.
Can can you go through each one and give us an example of sort of best practice, the first thing that jumps to your head of brands that do each of these in the most exemplary way?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And you're going to see example after example after example as I go through this presentation. So some of them I may lean on, but that's fine. We'll go through it real quick. But you may see the brands again that I'm talking about. So they trust what is being said. Powerful brands tell powerful truths about because of the credibility they carry. So in the case of Intel, that's an example I'm going to give you in a little bit. But we know and trust Intel. In fact, we trust Intel so much, we'll buy a computer that isn't that has the Intel brand on it. If it says Intel inside, we are likely to buy that computer because of Intel. That gets back to the powerful truths that it shares. There is consistency. So if we think about, I'll just grab one example, but the Apple brand, everything about Apple is consistent, right? Down to the packaging. You get a new iPhone in the mail, you know it's going to come, or you take it home, it's coming in a very beautiful box. You open that box, you know that everything in it is designed perfectly to fit the Apple product into it, including the way the earbuds are actually wrapped in its container. I've actually kept the container because it is so beautifully designed and it holds it perfectly. There is detail. Specifics add to the sense that something is real. Evidence such as numbers is very powerful. I'm going to talk about the Caterpillar brand in a little bit. And there's really, you're going to hear a lot about numbers as I talk about the Caterpillar brand. And that's a fun story because that's a B2B brand doing things big time in B2C. The next one, the story is concise wherever it needs to be. Brevity brings surety. And so I guess and there's elements of this and so I'm going to share it, is I love the Star Wars brand because it is concise where it needs to be concise. You know just enough about each character and about the story plot to be fully engaged. And then where it needs to or where it can, it will elaborate. Number 5, the story mirrors something of the way we all live. It feels real to them because the story talks about something they believe is real. You'll see this in a couple of brands, but I love the Coca-Cola brand for the way that it connects with us, these moments of treasured time in our lives. That's what they touch with, right? The first time you had a Coke, maybe with your dad or your mom, or with your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your significant other. The other one that brings this to mind for me is the Olympics brand. We all miss tremendously. The Olympics would be going on if it wasn't this month, it was going to be next month. And they're not happening in Tokyo this year because of COVID-19. And I tell you, I look forward with so much exuberance to the Olympics every 2 years, and of course every 4 years, whether it's summer or winter. So I can't wait till next year to celebrate the Olympics in Tokyo. And for me, that brand also is very real to me, and I can kind of connect my life back to the Olympic Games. And fortunately for me, I've worked on, I think more than a half a dozen Olympic Games, and I've been in those Olympic cities, and there's something really powerful about that. So hopefully those touched on specific examples that maybe help this come to life.
That was great, Pete. Sorry for dragging you back.
No, this is good. This is what I encourage.
Okay.
So,
I have a question. I do have a question about that.
Sure, April.
Okay, so as far as like back to the last slide that you were just on,
Yeah.
Now I'm a realtor, so my brand, I don't really physically have a product that I'm actually, like packaging.
You are the brand,
like
April.
Yeah, so I'm the brand. So how, using those 5 steps, how would I be able to, so I'm transitioning from me working with a builder, I'm selling their product, into me being the brand. And I'm trying to figure out how I could utilize those 5 steps with me being the brand.
Yeah, and that's a great question, April. And I actually have a presentation on personal branding that I
Okay.
need to take you through. But I'm the brand also, right? Many of us on
Mhm.
this call today are the brand. And in many cases, what I say is for even for companies that start with products or services, if they're the founder, they are the face of that brand. Examples of that are huge, right? Are Steve Jobs with Apple or Elon Musk with SpaceX or Jeff Bezos with Amazon. I mean, both of those are huge, right? But at one point,
Mhm.
they were working out of their garage. Now, the thing I would tell you is look at all of these things. And the best way to think about it, April, is to be true to yourself and be the person you are outside of your workspace. And be that same person in your workspace. So be trustworthy, be consistent in who you are. Don't have a different kind of look or mannerisms or approach. I say everything communicates, right? So whatever you're doing on social media should be the same thing you would do when you meet with somebody, as far as the way that you engage and the authenticity in with you engage should be the same. And of course, in everything, I do believe brevity is important. So tell people what they need to hear, and then listen. I guess the way that they say it is, God gave us two ears and one mouth, right? So you should listen twice as much as you should talk, right? Listen to your customers, your prospective clients, see what they have to say, and then be very very concise in how to answer those questions and do it with authenticity. And then, and just be real. I know you, April, to be real. You were real back when you and I were in the classroom together. You're a very real person. This is something that you do naturally. So I would say that for now. And then I'm going to do a session on personal branding, and I'll make sure that we invite you to that session.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
May I interject a little something here?
Sure.
To me, when you're going to start a story or to start any kind of brand, you need to decide what 1 to 3 things that you want to be essential to what that brand yourself, what you want that image to be. It needs to, and maybe just one, because of the issue of brevity. As soon as you start adding all these other things, you miss, and your focus can be very confusing. Your consumer is not going to take very long at all, maybe no more than 15 seconds to evaluate your message or your story. And if you haven't gotten them in that time, you've probably lost them. It's, I think, Pete, why don't you comment on this when I'm finished? But like in your case, different things might be you want to communicate trust, you might want to communicate knowledge of the properties, you might want to communicate a specialization in an area, you might want to communicate easy to work with, but pick out no more than 3 key things, and then in everything that you do, try to have it circle back to one of those so you can build trust, constancy, and consistency that can be communicated in a brief, clear way. I only say that because I've been where you are, and you get stuck with all these things you want to communicate. Cut them out, get it down to 1 to 3. Pete, what do you think of that? Because you watched me go through different confusion with different companies, and
I couldn't agree with you more, Bob. I think you're spot on, and you're going to see in a few slides here talk about living the brand, right? And living the brand allows you to communicate all the other things while you focus on meeting that need of your target audience, that critical need, and that comes out in the brand positioning. But what we talk about is your story, the way you communicate your story to your target audience. That's what marketing is all about. I mean, let's simplify it down to that. Telling your story to your target audience is the marketing of your brand, your product, your service, yourself. So I 100% agree, Bob. Thank you so much for adding that. And I would say, I love the Chupa Chups brand. We're on this slide with it. I mean, talk about consistency, right? That logo has been around since 1968. They refresh it every year, but you're never going to be confused about it because they're very clear and concise and brief on this particular product, and nobody's going to confuse it with anything else. Okay, let's jump to Netflix, which we all love so dearly. Why do we love it? Because Netflix has encouraged people to consume stories differently. From once or when they came to catch the whole series at a time. I'm sure we're all guilty of this, or guilty is probably the wrong word. We've all played into this, which is, I want to watch something now and I want to watch all of it. Or maybe I'll pause now and watch some later because I'm exhausted. But they actually tee it up, I should say, so that if you're watching a Netflix series or a series on Netflix, it will start to play the next one in the series unless you take action to stop it. And if you're like me, you've probably fallen prey to this where it just started and you were like, okay, I'll just watch one more. I don't care if it's 11:45 and I have to get up at 6 because I am so captured by this. And with no commercials, the viewer has complete control. But what has this done that has created some problems? Well, by weaning audiences from live viewing and teaching them to binge on their own schedule without commercials, Netflix is effectively killing the goose that laid the golden egg. This is a quote from someone from The Guardian, right? And this author says, while audiences are watching more television than ever, they're watching less of it, causing ad revenue to shrink. A big part of the problem is ad buying system built around live viewing and the Nielsen ratings to measure it. That mistake is compounded by the ads industry's inability to work out how to serve up similarly robust ad load. All that is to say is Netflix saw an opportunity, they pounced on it, and the rest of the world has been reeling ever since. Are they better than they used to be? Yes, but this thing is still not figured out. And it's all about wanting to see and hear and consume story. So how do we live a great story? And this is something that I've seen some brands do better than others. So the problem for many brands is that while they're good at telling stories, most have yet to learn how to live a story. What do I mean by that? Brands have tended to use stories for communications, right? It's one way. They've told those stories in short bursts in ad campaigns, right? You'll see a series of ads. Sometimes it's the same ad over and over and over and over, and you want to just shoot yourself. Sometimes they're smarter and they'll actually put a few of these ads together and they'll create a short story around whatever the principal thing they're trying to communicate. But for many years, these are just basically media flights, one-way advertising only. And then another one, right? On and on and on and on. And they're all loosely held together with little tie back to how the story is consumed today. So there are some examples of brands that have figured this out. One example, this happened a number of years ago, but I thought it was pretty impressive. I was watching American Idol, and Ford was one of the major brands advertising American Idol. And what did they do to make themselves more relevant? This is not on Netflix. This is watching live television. What they did was they had the Idol contestants actually involved in the advertisements for the Ford vehicle that they were promoting that day. So you got to continue to watch the story of the Idol, American Idol, while watching the commercial around Ford. And they integrated the Ford brand in everything about the show. And I thought they did it pretty masterfully. So that's an example where a brand was living a story. And there's other examples. Lifebuoys, Help a Child Reach 5, and Always Like a Girl. Those are examples of living a story. And so today we need to think about brands, solutions that are multi-dimensional, integrated, and require the inputs of a range of suppliers. I'm going to get into that in a little bit more in the coming slides. But let's talk about universes. A universe provides a context for a series of immersive experiences, which is multimedia or multidimensional, that happen inside that world, right? So let's think of some universes. DC Comics, they have the DC universe, Lord of the Rings, Avatar, 1984, Star Trek, Star Wars. But the interesting thing is, while this seems relatively new, Sir Thomas More's Utopia had this way back in the day. And it's the whole idea of this place where you can go and you know all of the rules and regulations. So we're going to get into this a little bit more with an example with Batman. But here's another universe. For those of you that are fans, you'll recognize these characters. This is part of Halo. There's a company called 343. They're the makers of the Halo brand, and they're part of Microsoft, and they're based out of Seattle, Washington. I went to visit their headquarters for a few years back, and this is what I saw, and I apologize for the quality of these images. These are pictures that we saw that I saw in their offices. You walk in there and you see this Master Chief who is like 8 foot tall, greeting you at the entrance, and this huge sculpture, like takes on a living, breathing reality, and you're like, okay, I just entered the Halo universe. Universe gives creators the space and environment they need to roam, uncovers, revert, focus, elaborate, and they typically are cross-referenced. So I talk about brand universes where consumers, fans, enthusiasts can go into the universe, stay as long as they want there, leave when they want, come back when they want, and if it's done well, that person, that fan will feel comfortable in that universe for whatever period and never feel like they're disconnected with the brand. Here's another example. Most of you will recognize this. This is Rogue One, part of the redefining of the Star Wars universe. This came out a number of years ago. This was part of when Disney acquired Lucas Brands, right? And so what they wanted to do was create this new element or new part of the Disney world. So they set about infilling the saga with new stories that fit in and around the chronological episodes, right? It had to have the same level of detail that all of the Star Wars stories had, because it had to be real. And if Disney didn't do it right, which they always do it right, you would feel disconnected with that brand. So that expanded universe, as termed by Lucas, was built on narratives that took the characters the moviegoers knew many years into the future. And I mentioned this as an example with Star Wars earlier because I think they do such a great job. At the same time, it revealed new personalities, new characters, right, who had stories of their own. And we're learning and getting to love all of these new characters, which is awesome, right? Because it's just creating more and more and more of the same. For those of you who were on the last webinar, I talked about the Winnie the Pooh brand and how that Pooh brand had grew in scale and was addictive, right? I thought Pooh was a character that Disney had created. Turns out it was created back in the 1930s, and Disney didn't even buy it till the 1960s. But as far as I was concerned, not knowing that history, to me, that character was always part of the Disney family, and it just made sense. And similarly, this will happen with people that are becoming acquainted with the Star Wars brand. They'll know this as a Disney brand first and foremost. They won't, in the future, people probably won't even know that George Lucas was the original creator unless they do some research. So new books and programs were released that added new layers and new revenue streams to the Star Wars universe. And as we all know, more and more of these feature films and other platforms are being added with Disney Plus and all these other things of exclusive viewing that's part of this Star Wars universe.
Pete.
Yes, sir.
Bob here again. If you would, just as you're going on, address that, you might want to do it now, but I think you might want to do it as you continue your presentation. I have a problem. It's easy for me to create all these different stories. The problem is I have a tendency to confuse rather than to bring them all to the central story. To me, there needs to be some sort of a primary central story of any brand. And I'll use the example of the packaging with Apple, which, you know, I just, like you, I love it. And I actually have a box of it right here, I believe. They do a superb job of it, but I don't think that's a central story. They're not a packaging company. The central story is, I think, that they make things easier and simpler. But how do we do all of these stories, but make sure that they tie into a central theme? If you just kind of mention that as you're going along, you may want to address it now, but you may just want to do it.
Well, I'll touch on it for just a second, but I appreciate you bringing it up. In the Apple example, their tagline is "Think differently," right? They are all about us approaching the world in a different way, and they're about, as you say, allowing us to engage with their products to do the things that we were meant to do. They don't talk about, their purpose is not about creating the latest and greatest technology for the sake of technology. They're about allowing their customers to use their products to enable them to think differently. And so that is their central theme. And what I've talked about in the past, so I'll try to remember as we go along, because I think it's really valuable. And I've encouraged others that are on this call today to do this, is to define what your why is, why you do what you do. For me, why I do what I do is because I want to empower each of you on this call and others to be the best you can be as you expand your brand, grow, and thrive with it, right? And for me, a lot of what I get purpose around is encouragement. I feel that is something that I'm gifted with. And when I see someone who's got something special, and every one of you on this call have that, I want to encourage you as much as possible. And then where I can, I want to add my knowledge to make your world more successful. But I also understand that I'm just one component in this. And so with all of us on this call, and all of us in our own, this kind of brand alive universe, I encourage you, using the word encourage, to engage with each other, because through that, we're going to be even more successful. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Bob, and I'll try to remember to reinforce that theme. So, in the case of, and we all recognize this logo, right? That's Batman. There's a story world here, right? And Batman, his story, and I'll get into it a little bit more detail, but operates within the clear rules of engagement in this city, this phantom, or this, kind of fictional city called Gotham. Batman, and if you've seen Batman Begins, the movie, right, you'll know kind of where he came from. His parents were killed when he was little, and he lost his way, and he goes to a distant land, and he almost dies, but he recovers, he gets trained, and he comes back to really bring justice to the world. And he doesn't trust the police because the police weren't there when he needed them, and they don't frankly trust him because he's a renegade, right? He is a fugitive who thinks he can, that the laws of society don't apply to him. So both of them share a goal of getting rid of crime, though. So they can work together, and they do on occasion. So what does this do? Batman offers consistency and predictability to how he's going to behave, making this character believable. We see examples of this in the world today. I think back in, I want to say like the 1970s or 80s, or maybe it was the 90s, probably the 80s. There was a guy who started riding the subway system in New York City because crime would run amok. And he brought individuals on those subways, and they were there to police those subways to make sure that people could ride safely. And they were, for a while, they were really endeared by the people of New York. And of course, the police were like, this guy is out of his lane. He shouldn't be doing this. But there was that world. And this is a real world example of kind of what Batman represents. Peter von Stackelberg refers to universes, and getting back to universes and now story worlds, the governing principles and parameters by which occupants of the story world will adhere. And I want to share that a story world extends a framework for the interactions that characters have towards each other. Its role is to help build a powerful mythology, an understanding of the world and its purpose that attracts people to the universe. So these worlds aren't real, right? But there's a lot of elements in these worlds that are believable and that we can buy into. And that's what captures our imagination and what draws us in. So here's a case study for Terminator 2. And I love this case study because it is a play on the original movie Terminator. And as we know with most movies, right, typically a sequel is not nearly as successful as the original. And especially if that original was a mega hit, right? There's been a few examples. Godfather 2 is an example of a successful sequel. And Terminator 2 would be one of those also. So what was the situation? Okay, Terminator 2 Judgment Day film T2 came out on July 3rd of 1991, and it was a sequel to the movie Terminator that was launched in 1984, and whose mythology is rich and powerful, right? With a universe that was deep and defined. Schwarzenegger's character, right? He was the original Terminator, was an inferior model called a T2, right? And in Terminator 2, there was a new model that came out that was much more advanced. And it actually had these morphing capabilities. And so what Schwarzenegger had to do was come back and protect the main character, or the main, I guess, protagonist, John, who was the future leader of the resistance, against this T-1000. The problem was, for Terminator 2, the owners of this brand, they did not have rights to the Schwarzenegger character. So how do you develop a brand licensing program when the main character is not available for use? So what they did was they used story, mythology, and universe to create a line of merchandise, all without Schwarzenegger's likeness. And that the reason for that was because they were not granted when this movie was made. So what did they do? They licensed a wide range of products, from toys to apparel to books to collectibles to replicas of iconic pieces of the film, such as the endoskeleton and the endo arm. These things allowed this program to be successful. And what were the results? T2 was broke ground in many ways in the technology area. And for that reason, and the success of the way that they created this program, it reached a level of success that few R-rated films ever achieved. They sold more than $1 billion of retail licensed merchandise worldwide. So an example where there was tremendous mythology, tremendous story, and now taking this and making it into a merchandise program through licensing. But one of the key components of that, which was the main character, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the T2, was not part of it, but they still were able to be very successful. Oh, and I guess to go back on that, this is a whole theme of, good versus evil, right? And so that was what this story was playing on. That's simplistic, but hopefully it gets to the kind of the root cause of what we were intrigued by.
Hey, Pete, can I just insert something real quick in there?
Yeah, please.
So it also played on the idea of humanity and what creates, what is a human person. So the T2 is actually, supposedly not to be emotionally driven and what have you, but in the interaction with the main protagonist, the son, he actually brings out humanity, or redefines what it could be. So really, in the end, what I'm really trying to get at, though, is that there's the human emotional aspect to the brand and to the story. And I think that was also a big driver as far as why it was successful, besides all the other pieces that you mentioned. So overall, in branding and such, some of the things that we also need to incorporate is also that, what's that emotional hook? Like, why should people care, right? So that's the biggest piece there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anita. I love that contribution. That was a huge part of it, right? And I guess they reprogrammed Schwarzenegger's character, the T2, to respond emotionally, and we started to see that character as having the real elements of a human person. So that's a great ad. Thank you so much for that. And probably that is a large part of the reason why that program was successful.
But I'm saying, just in larger aspect, though, it's also important to our brandings or the programs that we're, pushing forward or what have you. I mean, there's always that emotional draw that those programs are more successful when you have that emotional draw or hook from your audience or from your target demographic.
100%. We talk about functional benefits as being really important, right? The thing does what it's supposed to do, but consumers buy, individuals, people buy on emotion. And so that's kind of gets back to that whole part where I talk about why you do what you do is so important, because the why draws the emotional part. Yes, you have to have a product that is superior or as good as the other competitors, but if you can connect emotionally, that's when you're going to really engage people in a meaningful way. So you're spot on, Anita. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I told you earlier that I would talk about Intel and Apple, and here are the two brands. And we're getting into this whole thing of the mythology of the brand. We started touching on that a couple of slides back, right? In the context of a brand, the universe can be thought of as the ambition or purpose of the brand. And this mythology encompasses the ideas, rules, and beliefs that hold the universe together and drive it forward, making it expandable, right? There has to be this understanding of these ideas, rules, and beliefs so that we know the structure from which we engage with that brand or with that story. So here's some examples. Intel built its mythology on Moore's Law. And for those of you who don't remember what Moore's Law is, it was the idea that the density of a chip would double every 2 years. So if you're Intel and you're making chips, they're basically saying the power of the chip that they're creating will double every 2 years. And so they are cannibalizing their sales because they know that technology is going to drive them forward. And they've decided that they're going to be the best in the world in doing that. So if their competitors aren't keeping up with Moore's Law and with their ability to capture Moore's Law, then they're going to be inferior. And that's why we love to buy computers that have the Intel logo on the outside, because we know that their chip is in the inside. For Apple, they built their whole mythology around this idea of the vision of Steve Jobs. And I talked earlier about how Steve Jobs was really the powerful force of the Apple brand. And even though he's been dead for a number of years, he is still alive and well in many ways within Apple. So continuing with this thought, or this principle of mythology, for B2C brands, you should focus on the product or its vision of the world. So getting back to this whole idea of what is it you're trying to create with the product, thinking about your brand, how does your brand serve its purpose? And if you're a B2B brand, it may be driven by a wish to change how business happens. And so, that can happen in a number of ways. And if we think about some great B2B brands, and I talked about Caterpillar, I'm going to talk about Caterpillar more, they engage in a meaningful way. Another B2B brand that I love and I was affiliated with a number of years ago was the Rubbermaid Commercial Products brand. That has a mythology and it's a mystique to it within the world in which they live, right? If you're work for a hospital or you work for a hotel or an airport, you know that Rubbermaid Commercial Products brand, and you learn to trust it because of not just the incredible design and durability of the products, but all the service that comes behind it. And they've got a rich history that has formed their mythology. So I love what Simon Waters has to say about mythology. He is the general manager for Hasbro Consumer Products. So some of the things that he shares is that the biggest impression you're seeking to build should be based on the core DNA of the brand. And so you should think about things like, what could it be? Where could it go? Who else could be involved? What could happen? And if you think about any of the Hasbro brands, these questions have been answered. And we'll get to that in a little bit more detail shortly. So Simon Waters goes on to say, build a story for the brand that goes far beyond a game, an event, or a product, and that only becomes stronger and more powerful as others contribute and partner. And for Hasbro Consumer Products, they're working with dozens and dozens of licensing companies, right? These are they've built their own brand, they've created products and sold those products, and then they're engaging with a number of partners. Some of them are licensees, some of them are retail partners, some of them are film producers to create these worlds for these Hasbro brands. So after you've done that, Waters says, through storytelling, a brand like Hasbro looks to take consumers to a different understanding, one with which fans are passionately engaged. He says, we'd like to take the consumer on a journey. He goes on to say, organizationally, I would say that we are great storytellers. Once you tell a great story, it is really easy to fit all the chapters together. You kind of know where it is headed. And when he says you kind of know, he means the fan, the consumer. They know where it's headed, and they're excited to go there, even though they kind of know where it's headed, because they know that there's going to be some surprise along the way, which is going to make it more fun. And as Waters says, and I would agree 100%, Hasbro does a good, I would say, great job of telling its brand franchise story. And for them, storytelling is a medium that people have used for hundreds of thousands of years. There's no better way to do that than telling a story. So I've talked about Caterpillar for a number of times throughout this presentation. Now let's talk about this case study, right? So Caterpillar was founded in the late 1800s. Today is about a $50 billion company that makes large dirt-moving products for farming and construction globally. These products are sold business to business and have a high price point. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars, right? And Caterpillar, whose brand is known for ruggedness and reliability, desired to connect with consumers around the world. Well, why would they want to do that? Well, there's many reasons for that. First of all, if they can connect with a small child, that child may grow up loving the Caterpillar brand. And if she or he has a choice later in life to purchase a product for their needs of their business, they could choose, or they may wish to choose, Caterpillar over some other competitor. It also may be somebody who loves the brand so much that they want to become a stockholder in the company. Or there's somebody that has had an interest in the brand from a B2B perspective, but now wants to build it into their own personal universe, and so wants to have a watch or a pair of boots, or maybe even a mobile device protective carrier. So what was the task? The task was to launch a brand licensing program to connect consumers directly with the Caterpillar brand. And according to Kenny Beaupre, who is the manager of Caterpillar brand licensing, he said, "We have been able to partner with some great companies that have done a lot to build the brand in their respective categories. 25 years ago when we started, we asked what kind of products would a tractor owner need to do their job. We got into safety shoes, workwear, and eye protection. We were able to then cross over. Consumers gave Caterpillar permission to extend into new categories, and you see some of those on this slide. So what are the results? Today, the Caterpillar brand licensing program sells almost $3 billion of merchandise in dozens of categories globally." And Beaupre adds, "Anyone can logo slap and put a brand on anything. What has been successful for us is when we have used our brand and marketed to our brand attributes, the strength to the durability to the quality to the rugged to the tough. Wherever and whenever we have stayed close to our core attributes, that's when we have had success." So getting back to your point, Bob, earlier about what the purpose is, right? I think Kenny Beaupre summed it up really nicely right there about why they do what they do and how this program allows them to touch many, many people who would never come in contact with the brand if there wasn't this consumer B2C program through licensing. So here's another great story, great example of a brand with a rich story. The National Football League is rooted in story. It was founded in 1920. I didn't know this until I did the research for my book, Expand, Grow, Thrive. But 4 teams met in an Ohio car showroom to compete for the first time, right? This was their league, four teams. Today they have 32 teams. They're a multi-billion-dollar, multi-channel business. And the NFL Players Association, right? That comprises all the athletes. They give fans an opportunity to follow their favorite players outside of the game, right? And we're going to get into an example of that right away. But this is how these two brands, the NFL and the NFL Players Association, work together in a powerful way. So here's an example with Madden NFL. This is one way for fans to connect to the game and to the players when they're not watching the game. EA Sports has been licensed for more than 24 years now. The NFL has put out its 27th. Actually, this may be dated. It may be actually more editions have been put out. So the actual Madden NFL has actually been out longer than EA Sports has been a licensee. And EA built the players' rights included into this product. So what happens is draft night can occur, and a player may get drafted to a team, and you can play with your new player in the game Madden NFL that night when the player gets drafted, way before that player actually hits the real field. So that is really something cool about the way that this licensee EA Sports has engaged with both the NFL and the NFL Players Association to expand the universe of both of those properties to make the experience that much more exciting for fans around the world. So they're more than a game by far, right? They've given this elite sport a very human face through these players, through these licensed products. It's continuously refreshed. And I mentioned this earlier on in the presentation, right? That facts are really important, right? So we follow the stats and the opinions of those that are experts in helping us think about the game that we love and the players that compete in this game. So I wanted to show a couple of other examples of sports fandoms and universes. And we're just going to touch on these for a second. But you can see how they each have these universes, they have huge fandoms, and they have huge story. So there's a long list of heritage brands in sports, and these include Wimbledon. Wimbledon has been around forever. Sadly, there was no Wimbledon this year. It would have just completed, or just be in the middle of it, I guess, right now. This is July the 9th. Typically, I think the championship weekend would have been this weekend. And that is a phenomenal property that is so oversold that, you know, it's just something that is treasured. And the story gets back to the fact that, you know, there's such rich history of competition that goes back to its earliest days. It is the only major that's still played on grass. There's just so many elements about the Wimbledon property that make it such a compelling brand. Formula One, another example of a huge brand. It's not as popular in the United States, but globally it's extremely popular. There's only, I think, 15 actual competitions in 13 different countries globally, and the fans who follow this sport are rabid. The All Blacks, for those that don't know, this is the New Zealand rugby team. A country that comprises about 3 million people has fielded this team, and this team has won the Rugby World Championships multiple times, which just kind of have to scratch your head at the mystique of that. And you can see them, and this is their pregame ritual, right? Look at their faces. If you've never seen it, you should do a Google search or YouTube search on the All Blacks and their pregame ritual. You will just get mesmerized by it. And then the NBA, another example of a global property. They've been global for many years. I think they really reached the point where they became the kind of that tipping point to become global when the Dream Team, the original Dream Team, competed in 1992 and brought the NBA best players of the time to the Olympic Games. And it was phenomenal to see other countries' teams competing with the United States Dream Team. And literally these players that were competing with them were fans. They grew up loving these players, and they were now competing with them. And it was a really head scratcher for them because they idolized those players. And that's what really helped bring this brand to its global stature today. And then I mentioned the Olympics before, a phenomenal property that's been around in its new version since 1896 in Athens. So we have another case study. This one is on Major League Baseball and the Cooperstown collection. And I love this story because it talks about something that happened kind of happenstance, but turned into something very, very powerful. And so around 1989, some retired firemen, this is the way the story goes, right, opened a bar in Brooklyn, New York, right, called the Brooklyn Dodger. Peter O'Malley, the owner of the Los Angeles Dodgers, couldn't believe this could happen. Basically, he was like, what is going on? How are these guys getting away with this? Well, the truth was the Dodgers had never trademarked the rights to the Brooklyn Dodgers and had little recourse. So O'Malley charged Rick White, who was the CEO of Major League Baseball Properties, and said, I want this never to happen again. How do we stop it? And so Rick White was charged to basically create products that said Brooklyn Dodgers on them and interstate commerce. And so that was the genesis of this Cooperstown collection, where they created all of this old memorabilia, this old nostalgia of these teams that had played in former cities. And so that had all that history, and there was so much pent-up demand for this product, which they made really authentic, that in the first year they generated $30 million in royalties. And if you do the back of the envelope math, that's about $600 million at retail sales. So out of this thing with the Brooklyn Dodgers and O'Malley getting, like himself all worked up, came the Cooperstown collection. Pretty cool story. So I mentioned this with Hasbro and with other brands earlier, but creating universes is often done collaboratively. It's really hard to do it alone. And the reason for that is these brands need to work with other brands that act as innovators and inhabitants. They need to work with customers. I told you about the example with 323, which is the creator of the Halo franchise. They talk about this thing called Consumer 720, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Going forward, brands must build stories with others that consumers engage with and in which they feel a part. And they must also be open to letting consumers create matching worlds or to expand the universe itself, right? Listen to your fans. What are they saying about the brand? Where do they want the story to go? And build that into its story and its mythology. So I mentioned the 720. It stems from the interaction between the two rounded worlds. And that is that there's the 360, which is the world that 323 lives within, that's inward looking. That's how they think about the Halo brand. And then the other 360 is the outward looking. And so how do they engage with the fans of the brand to make the brand better? So we're down to kind of the last little bit on the summary, key takeaways. So I'll just pause for a quick sip of water and then we can jump into it. And then I can't wait for your questions. The more, the better. So great marketers tell stories that people want to believe. We talked about Seth Godin, what he said. Brands cannot simply go to market today with a narrative that's just about features, benefits, and price and be sustainable. As Anita Kestelar said earlier, right? It's about emotion. How do you connect emotionally to the brand? And when the brand connects emotionally with you, that's when people are driven to purchase or consume or try. In order to continually reach buyers, have something interesting to say at all times, and use the platforms available to you, including story, to make your brand heard. And I would say story needs to be a big part of what you're communicating. If you're going to build a connective story, then you need to provide people with multiple ways to connect with that story, and you need to provide them with control over the aspects of the narrative. Use short stories to bring people to the brand, make that story part of a bigger story that brings people to the brand looking for answers, and tie those strands together. Rogue One was an example of that, right? It tied together elements of the Star Wars brand that had existed before when Lucas created the original sequel and pre-sequel. Bring in partners that add to the story and help form the wider ecosystem. I talked about that with Simon Waters and Hasbro. Know your own backstory, stay true to what you were, and connect that with the story of who you are today. That's how you build true mythology, and that's what the great brands like Batman does. Think long-term rather than just campaign to campaign. Tell stories people relate to, not just those that make you feel comfortable. Link your world with theirs through story. And I gave the example with Ford with American Idol. So we're at the next, and I know we're running a little bit over, so I apologize, but I'll go through this relatively quickly. This is the storied expandability score chart, part of the lasso model. If you scored yourself a 1, it says we don't have a continuous story. It's campaign or product focused. The stories we do tell make our products more accessible, but we have not extended beyond that yet. Level 2, we're starting to extend our story through content marketing into various channels. We're engaging with our customers to help us do that. Level 3, we have a sense of a wider story, and we are working with partners to connect everything we have in ways that will make sense for our customers. We'd like to involve them more further down the line. Level 4, we have a purpose that drives us as a company. Our portfolio of brands reports to that ambition, but right now, they do that as separate brands. Each brand has a fiercely strong tribe of customers. And then finally, level 5, our brand is a multi-layer, multi-channel, multi-partner universe held together by principles that make it consistent and that enable us to work together to build out what we stand for and to shuttle stories back and forth across a range of time frames. Everything we do takes place within this context. And you saw several examples of that today in our presentation. So we are now at the Q&A part of our presentation. So I'll stop sharing. I know we've run late, so if you need to jump, I understand completely, but I'd like to stay on for a little bit longer and answer any questions or let you share your perspective. But I really enjoyed this, and I hope you got something out of it today. Yes, Johan.
Yeah, as always, Pete, this is amazing just to sit and listen to you. And I think you have told a very compelling story through what you have presented even. And I really applaud this and appreciate this opportunity. And as I embark on the story and the company of Entnest and so on, of course, we're very early there, but it's very inspiring to look at what these big brands over many years have created. But it does take time to create, right? And it's a lot of pitfalls in the beginning. So would you have some hints on what is the biggest pitfalls that you see when you talk about smaller or just starting brands? And I know that you worked with a number of big ones, but I'm sure you've also worked a lot with newly starting companies that has an aspiration to get to a completely different universe. Yeah,
thank you for that question. And remember, everyone, that those big brands used to be small brands.
Yes.
They were these guys. And the only reason I use the big brand examples is because we know them. But they started as small. I think what happens with many of us who are small brands is we get impatient. We think these things are overnight success stories, and truth be told, they're not. Many of these brands, in the case of like what Disney did, right? They find these brands that are already successful, and then they think about all the things that they can do to make it more successful. And they take a Star Wars brand, or they take a Winnie the Pooh brand, and they make it 5 times, 10 times bigger than it originally was. So I would say start with the first part, which is about not getting impatient. The second part, which is what Anita spoke about earlier, make sure it's emotionally connected. And make sure, and as we talked about with April earlier, be true to who you are, be true to the brand. Don't try to create something because you think you need to add some sexiness or some charisma to your brand. Your brand is going to be seen as authentic, if in fact it is authentic. And don't be impatient, and believe in what you do, because what you do does matter tremendously.
Okay, thank you for that. Very helpful as always, Pete.
My pleasure. Thanks, Johan.
Hey, this is Tom Ledbetter. Do you
Hey,
hear
Tom.
me?
Yes, sir.
For some reason, my TV, my video is not on, but what you were saying brought back to me something that I've thought about a lot. And I have a problem coming up with stories, yet I know how important they are. But I go back to a TED Talk. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the speaker, but his talk in his book is Start With Why.
Simon Sinek.
Simon Sinek. Thank you. Thank you. And most people want to start the conversation as, how do I do this? Or what do I sell? And Simon would say, and very, very well, that first you start with why. And you have really understand why you're doing this. And if it's just to make money, forget it and go do something else. But then you get to, okay, why is the center of like a target. The next line out is maybe what is I'm doing. And then the third line out there is how am I doing it? And what you're talking about here, I'm having trouble connecting the dots on a project that I'm working with. How do I do some core stories that can achieve what you're so eloquently talking about?
Well, Tom, thank you so much. I am a huge fan of Simon Sinek's. I've read his book and I adhere to all his principles, and I've advocated reading his book. So if you've watched the TED Talk, that's fabulous, but I would encourage you to read the book. It's about, I don't know, 200 pages, but it reads really fast and it's just completely engaging. He is an amazing author. What I would tell you, Tom, is what I do with my clients is I ask the client to give us the names of people that are connected with the history of the brand and the product, and then allow us to interview those individuals. So those could be co-founders of the organization, old existing customers that have been around who've bought the product for a long time, could be suppliers, could be other employees. And what we will do is ask them a series of questions about how they know the brand, what the brand stands for, and that helps us formulate a story about that brand. And many, many, many times, I think every time actually, we learn things that the client never knew about their own brand. And these help formulate the story of which then the brand can tell, in which it then markets its product or service. So I would say to you, that research can really shed tremendous light on what the real story is about the product or the brand that your clients represent. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you. Perfect.
Sir. Any other questions?
Yes, quick question here.
Sure. Hey, Michael.
Hey, well, first off, thank you very much, Pete, for your session today. It's excellent, as always. Bob, thank you for your suggestions. I wanted 3 things that you want your image to be. I thought those were spot on. And for the other questions, I feel like they added a lot of clarity, especially this session, more so than normal. So I appreciate everyone that's contributed. So my question, so in order for consumers to fully realize the story, to give it a human face, would it be effective to create my business story via a hardbound book, digital and physical, for all to explore? So the second question to that, furthermore, would you recommend creating a storied mini movie if possible?
Wow, Michael, that's a great question. I would want to probe a little bit more with you. If there is a book or if there's a story that needs to be written, if you feel like you need to write down this story and you feel like this story is one that you don't care if anyone reads it, but it needs to be written down so that you can tell it, then I would say that might justify writing the book. I knew for a long time that I wanted to write a book about this industry, this brand expansion industry. And I remember talking to people early on when I just formed my agency and told them that I was going to do that. And they looked at me like, and one of them said, well, that's a tall task. Good luck with that. Thinking that maybe I wasn't the right person to write it. And I just used that as more fuel in my fire to go about doing it. And then I said, I want to make sure that I do it the best way possible that incorporates way more than just who I am. So that's a way of saying it could very well be that you should write a book. But I wouldn't say write the book because you think that's something that you have to do in order to build your brand. Write the book because you feel like it's something that has to be written down and told. And then the feature film, which is kind of the secondary part of it, is just another way of telling your story. And truth be told, those are tactics. So if you can get down on paper what your story is and then think about who your target is, and I know we've talked about this a lot, then you might say, okay, how are the ways that I reach my target audience? And if you can say with a level of confidence that a good way to reach them would be through a book or through a film, then I would say that they probably have merit. But there may be many other ways as well that you can do it that potentially that are actually more effective. So that's saying basically it's possible. It might likely have a lot of credibility to doing it, but I would probe a little bit on why you think that's so important and why you feel like you can reach your target audience that way. And if you say it doesn't matter, I just feel like I need to write this book, that may be measure enough to write it.
Thank you. I was thinking more the lines of like when someone walks into a storefront or storefronts, that they sit down and there's a nice chair or chairs and a coffee table. And on that coffee table, there's maybe some treats. And on that coffee table, there's a hardbound book with a brief storyline, some pictures of what the company, who it is, what it represents, what the company has, the experiences and why it's important, the why in that. And then be able to expand that on to, more of an online presence as well. So not necessarily a book, although that's a great idea as well, the next step, but more or less like a kind of a short story of this is the company that you're supporting. This is why it's so powerful. And here's our story.
Yes, I would emphatically say yes to that. That is something that you should enable. Everybody who goes to a brand, whether it's via a website or through the physical presence, wants to know where this brand came from. And so having that available to them so they can get that question answered, I think is really important. And you will see on my website, I first address the needs of the potential prospect who's coming, and then I have a section on about, which is my backstory. So I love that idea. I think it's important. That helps your prospective client or your existing client to know why you do what you do and where you came from. That is the facts and figures of who you are, and that is really relevant to them, why they engage with you, and that might actually give them a more of a compelling reason for justification for why they're already working with you. And that just makes it more pleasurable for them.
Excellent. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Michael. Great question.
Hi, Pete.
Hey, Walter.
Michael.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It's, thank you very much for the last hour. Specifically, I like, the rich examples that you explained and that you decoded for us in such a detailed manner. I think is a very good help, and it gives some hints how to develop something in a similar way. Now, I think the biggest problem for people who start a business, because people who are now looking to develop a brand and tell a story, they start probably at the same level like many years ago, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, or something similar, or Elon Musk. And first of all, they might not be very fussed about creating the story. The story is something that follows the developments of the company. Nonetheless, I think it's useful if you want to become somebody who people talk about and some people who accept as an authority and trust, and hopefully following some traffic that generates business. I think everybody is looking for a model. And when I speak about a model, then I'm not talking about a copycat exercise, but extracting the things that people did well and look for analogies that could work in my context similarly. I'm talking especially about the me brands. That was something that was mentioned earlier. Or when you're working as a consultant or as a coach, you can fill all the potholes in England with life coaches, but how to stick out and represent an authority and trustworthiness. And as I just followed this while I was listening to what you said, a couple of examples came to mind. And I mean, one is absolutely, I think everybody can see it at the moment. It is the brand of Liverpool Football Club and the brand of Jürgen Klopp. And with it goes the engagement of the AXA insurance company and their slogan, "No, you can." And this is exactly what the football clubs, what Klopp, what the players all live, and it gives an incredible credibility to AXA, because here you can see living examples for straightforwardness plus empathy, for never allow complacency, and always be consistent and strive for more. Keep your quality level. And somebody who came to my mind, probably less prominent, but I think an equally good example. You may remember the football referee, FIFA referee, Pierluigi Collina, the bald-headed football referee who became an icon, who became the embodiment of a football referee, and who also was picked by Vauxhall and other companies as a figurehead for their campaigns. So thank you for your inspirations.
Oh my gosh, it's a pleasure, and what such rich quality commentary. I love your examples, and they are so spot on. And I think the thing that I take away from that is just be who you are, just be genuine, right? And then you live your world, and you're adding to your story every day, and that's what matters. That's what people know people, and they know what's real and what's not real. And what I heard from what you just shared, Walter, is a lot about authenticity, which is so important. And I'm not surprised that the sponsor and the team paired up together, because they see that each one adds to the other.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Anything else? I know we're about, wow, we're 12:20 right now. So I'm thrilled that you guys wanted to continue to stay on. I enjoyed this immensely. Story is really a fun topic, and thank you so much for your rich contribution.
So I ask you, what can you do today to make your brand come alive in the hearts of those who experience it?